Good morning, everybody. Good to see you this morning. Of course, today begins the gospel meeting. I'm certain that you can be here with us. We will have a meal after service, and we invite everyone to partake in the meal. There'll be plenty of food. The ladies here always provide plenty of food, so we look forward to that kind of fellowship with you. If you're visiting with us, we're certainly glad that you're here with us. If you're watching online, we're glad that you're able to be with us through that avenue. We're thankful to God that we're able to bring that to you. This morning, this man needs no introduction here at Ribbon Frames. Louis back with us. Flo and Miss Emily will be here for worship service. Such a blessing. He told me this morning that Emily will be with us. That's such a blessing. So we're certainly glad to have them. Lad will be with us tonight. I don't know if you remember Louis' son, Lad. He'll be with us tonight. We're certainly glad to have him. We'll have prayer, and then we'll let Louis talk to us. Michael, will you lead us in prayer?
Will you bow with me? Dear Heavenly Father, we want to thank you for this day that you've allowed us to have. Father, thank you for all the blessings that you give us in this day. May we open up your word, Father, and may we be able to take something from it and apply it to our everyday lives. Be with Louis as he presents your word to us, and may we understand it the way you want us to understand it. Be with the ones that are sick, Father, and the ones that's lost loved ones. Just love them as only you can. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen.
Good morning. I'm going to stick this on, but I'll go ahead and start reading as I try to get this thing fired up. Thank you guys for having me. It's always not only a pleasure to be here, but I get excited. I get excited about the chance to develop a lesson and to talk to you guys about whatever it is that I do. Yes, sir. I'll explain the tie here in just a minute. If there's dust on this, it's only been out once in the past 4 years, and that was for a funeral. But I have personally never been the guy to speak at a gospel meeting. I just never have. I've spoke in the evening services of various things, but when you guys talked to me about speaking at your gospel meeting, I decided that I would mark the occasion with a coat and tie. It does make me feel like, because I'm serious, the only time I've worn this, I believe the only time I've worn it since I've retired as a TB agent has been at funerals. And so I don't feel that way about it. I'm excited to be here. I don't feel like it's a funeral, but it is odd. It's odd to speak with a tie on. So if you see me starting to waver and start to go down, somebody getting me some air, just loosen this thing up. I even have the top button buttoned, which I had to think how to do it, to be honest with you. But enough about my attire. But I did. I wanted to mark the occasion because this is your chance as a congregation to open your doors to friends, family, community people who aren't normally here, and that's what the gospel meeting is about. I hope that today starts a series of studies. I know Lad and I had talked, a month ago about what we might do, and as we were looking at these things, we wanted our lessons to dovetail with each other, and we're hoping that the other ones do the same. But if nothing else, what we seek to do is answer questions in our own minds and then hope that you've had those questions before in your minds. And that's really the intention here. I'm going to talk about something today that I think you've heard sermons on before, that you've probably sat in classes on before. But I always personally, when I've sat in these classes, when I've heard these sermons, I've had a couple of questions that came up in my mind, and so I've sought to answer those questions, and then I'll let you walk along with me as we go through this study. Of that day and hour,
You probably recognize that to be the beginning of a verse where Jesus, red letters, where Jesus is actually talking about the day that he's going to come back. Do you realize that if you actually had that day, that if you had it circled in your calendar and you knew it was that day, do you know how valuable that would be? I mean, it would be incredible to actually have that. I don't know if I would ever want it. I'll be the first to tell you. And frankly, I think I'm wise enough to know. I'm not saying I'm wise, but I think I'm wise enough to know that I need to not know that day personally. But be that as it may, it would be an incredibly valuable piece of information if indeed we did know that day. Yes, sir. Oh, I think even more so than people panicking as it got closer. Think of all the people that would have lived their life if we knew that day, knowing that it wasn't coming during their lifetime. And if somehow you had a date and it was so far off that you knew that you'd never live to it, I think that would change the manner, and that's what we're actually going to talk about today. But I think it would change the manner of how you approach the Scriptures. When Jesus takes an opportunity to talk about that day, it's because his disciples actually asked him. They actually asked him about this. So let's take a look. So I've been studying personally the parables of Jesus. I've been with the Sunday school class that I teach. I've been working with some other folks, and they're also working on some parables. In fact, one of them is doing a lesson on parables in that class today. But each of the folks in that class took either one or more of the parables and are looking at them with a fresh set of eyes. And so ultimately, when we look at the parables of Jesus, and I think I spoke about this last time, this is how Jesus, I say it's a look at how Jesus looks at how we look at things. And that's really what a parable is. It's simply an earthly message that has heavenly meaning. It's a message for all the ages. It's not just for the people of that day, though it meant something specific to the people of the day, and I think you'll see that when we go through the study. But ultimately, we need, because it was spoken nearly 2,000 years ago, we need to strive to put it in context. If we have context like the who, the what, the when, the where, if we have those things, it actually sets our understanding on a higher pedestal. And so, just for completeness sake, you have already seen, if you were here last time we talked about what parables are. I'm not going to go through all that, but I do put those slides in there because if you end up at the end of this lesson going, oh, I'd like to go and get that lesson, you don't have to go back to the one I did 3 weeks ago or however long it's been. You'll have it right here. But just note that a parable is simply a wise saying that comes from authority. And in the New Testament, that particular word, parabole, it's actually been used right at 50 times, and 46 of those 50 times, most translations actually call it parable. A couple of times it says it's used in the way of a comparison. But ultimately, we talked about at some other time who wrote each of those four Gospels. Note that the Gospel of John, even though he wrote that mostly to people we assume in the Ephesian area, it has no parables in it whatsoever, but the other three Gospels do. And of course, we know that Matthew wrote his Gospel to essentially Hebrew Christians, but to a Hebrew crowd. And then we know that Mark wrote his more of a Gentile audience. And then Luke was actually attempting to write a history. And I think that's going to show up today, especially in the lesson from the pulpit. But ultimately, it's always good to know which of your parables sit in which of the different Gospels, because there are certain Gospels. I'm going to talk about one parable in the worship service, and it is only It's actually only in Luke. It's not in the other ones. And you see the reason why once you understand that Luke was writing a history really for a Roman official, but potentially to reach not only the Romans but Greeks with this message. And so ultimately, sometimes it's good to know that. So I stuck that slide in there. It just simply lists all of the parables that are in the other, those first three Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. But then the parables that are only in Luke, I've given you a slide there just so that you can have that denoted. We don't need to go through any of those. By the way, I've got highlighted the 10 minas. That's the one I'm going to be talking about in the worship service. But ultimately, why study the parables? They are the word of the Word, right? In the beginning was the Word. These are His words. Why wouldn't we listen to them? But there's some other things. They absolutely have this purpose. They have this purpose to tell us who God is and how man can actually become like God, not a God, but come like God through Jesus Christ. That's really what the transition in concept is. Also, I like to mention that they're often told in groups, and that's really important if you're looking at the parables to look at the groups, because Jesus will often stack them to get a more complete set of concepts of whatever He's talking about across to His audience. The other thing is they tell us things that we won't figure out on our own, or otherwise He wouldn't have to tell us. So they very often have surprise endings. Let's hope that they change us as well. So when we look at these parables, and we're going to look at one today, I've tried to discipline myself with this. I try to pray before I start that parable study. And then I go and I read that parable. I try to let the Word of God speak to me before I start using any of the other tools that are at all of our disposals. But also, once I've read that, when I'm doing it, I'm trying to figure out who the audience is, what gospel it was written in, who specifically did Jesus actually talk to, was it in response to a question, those kind of things. And then ultimately, try to figure out what it was those people needed to hear, because if they needed to hear it, quite possibly I need to hear it, and that's why it's recorded. And then I also will consider any of the other parables that have some things in common, and we're actually going to see that today. So ultimately, we're going to start with this parable. If you will go to Matthew, it's chapter 25. Look at verses 14 through 30. I'm going to, I've got it saved on my phone here, and so I'm going to pull it up. I use the Blue Letter Bible app, which if you don't have that, you may take a look at it. You can get a free version of it. It's incredible. It not only has so many different versions of the Bible, ones that you're comfortable with. I use quite often the New King James Version, but I also use the English Standard Version. But I know other folks are more comfortable with certain versions of the Bible. So it has that, but it has all these other tools. I won't try to sell it to you, just to let you know it definitely indeed is it's a great tool to have, because I'm never without this thing, or if I am without it, it's by mistake. So if we look down here and we start, you're going to see, you probably in your Bibles, whether it be a physical Bible or an electronic Bible, you probably have something that says Parable of the Talents. And before your eyes roll back in your head and say, this is the 101st lesson I've had on talent, hang with me. I hope I'll tell you some things that you haven't seen before, or that you haven't thought about, or potentially you thought about but didn't know about these. But it starts off, for it will be like. What is the it? The kingdom. Jesus has already spoken a couple of other parables. He's already spoken a couple of other parables, but let's just read it. It says, for it, talking about the kingdom, will be like a man going on a journey who called his servants and entrusted them his property. Back in the old days, back in that time, you tended to have two types of people that you would do something like this. One type was actually called a word that meant guardians, and they were people who actually watched over other people. So perhaps you had a group of servants or you had a group of workers, and so this would be the person who managed them. That's not the person who's talked about here. That person actually was talked about earlier in another parable. But then you had what was typically the word used was overseer, and that overseer was over physical properties and monies. And that's what we're talking about here. So it says, to one he gave 5 talents, right? It said to another he gave 2, and to another he gave 1, each according to his ability. So in other words, he associated the abilities of that particular servant to whether or not they could handle that amount of money. And so he's already laid out an order of what he thinks a particular servant is going to be able to do. But then he said this. Oh, I just changed the color of my Bible. Then he said this. He entrusted them to his property. He gave 1 5, 1 2, 1 1, and then he went away. He who had received the 5 talents went at once and traded with them, and he made 5 more talents. So also he who had 2 talents made 2 talents more, but he who had received the 1 talent went and dug in the ground and hid his master's money. Now after a long time, the master of those servants came and settled accounts with them, and he who had received the 5 talents came forward, bringing 5 talents more, saying, Master, you delivered to me 5 talents. There I have made 5 talents more. His master said to him, Well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful over a little. I will set you over much. Enter into the joy of your master. And he also, who had the 2 talents, came forward, saying, Master, you delivered to me 2 talents. Here I've made 2 talents more. His master said to him, Well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful over a little. I will set you over much. Enter into the joy of your master. He also, who had received the 1 talent, came forward, saying, Master, I knew you to be a hard man, reaping where you did not sow and gathering where you scattered no seed. I want to interject something right here, something that you might not know about that particular culture in the world. And the thought process of actually making gain commercially, like commercial interest, the way that credit card companies do with credit cards today. Making that kind of commercial interest was not actually always thought of as something to be considered a good characteristics. I don't want to dive too deep into it, but ultimately, the person who did that often was considered in that culture to be sort of a user or someone who was greedy. Now, I'm not saying anything about this guy. I just want you to know what the background of that culture was. It's certainly by the time the Romans and eventually that took over, that was gone. But among the Greeks, and frankly, among just the people that we would now think of as Middle Eastern, Babylon and Assyria, that was sort of a undercurrent of that particular day. Yes, sir?
What struck me about that comment is that I think he's trying to avoid rodeo by
Oh, I think you're right. I think this particular servant who was afraid of facing his master with a loss, that he was trying to essentially say, hey, I know that you're hard. I know that you're a strict guy. And so rather than lose, I'd rather face you with not gaining rather than lose. I have no doubt that that's what his thought process was.
Really?
But look at what the hard master is going to say about this. It says, so I was afraid and I went and hid your talent in the ground. Here you have what is yours. So he simply was a safeguard. He didn't really oversee this property. He safeguarded it. And then ultimately his master answered him, you wicked and slothful servant. You knew that I reap where I have not sown and I gathered where I have not scattered seed. Then you ought to have invested my money with the bankers, and at my coming I should receive what was my own with interest. So take the talent, this is him announcing this, so take the talent from him and give it to the one who has 10 talents. For everyone who has more will be given, and he and he will have abundance, but from the one who has not, even what he has will be taken away. And cast the worthless servant into the outer darkness, in that place where there'll be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Now, I will tell you, just glance down. We're not going to read it, but just glance down and see what the next verse is looking like there. Talking about the coming of the Son of Man, of that day and hour. That's where we started this. Why did Jesus tell this parable? To whom did Jesus tell this parable? Let's go take a look at that. So ultimately, Jesus told this parable to his disciples, the people, the men who became the apostles. He was not preaching to a crowd when he said this parable. He said this to his disciples. I want you to go back and look. His disciples, flip all the way back over to 24 in your Bible. Go to chapter 24, look right up at the top and see what the setting was. I'll go with you. The setting was this, chapter 24, Matthew. Jesus left the temple and was going away when his disciples came to point out the buildings of the temple. Hey, Jesus, I think this was probably a common thing. It was a wonder. It was a wonder. The building itself was truly a wonder. Just like we go to Mount Rushmore, just like we go to the Washington Monument, just like we go to some things that we have built as men, but we look at that and we go, that's incredible. That's incredible. You know, I've never been to Mount Rushmore, but I always hear that when you go there and you walk this way and it looks like their eyes follow you. You know, that conversation happens at those types of things, and this is that conversation. And then Jesus answered them this. He says, you see all these, do you not? Truly I say to you, there will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down. Now, Jesus was making a prophecy about something that was impending. And I want you to know, Jesus, we believe, died somewhere around AD 30 to AD 33, somewhere in there, right? Well, by AD 70, that actually happened. The Roman government came in and besieged Jerusalem. They eventually tore that temple and razed it. It sounds like I'm saying raised like you raise corn, but it's R-A-Z-E-D, raised, which means to tear to pieces. Razed it to the ground. And there are historical documents that have nothing to do with the Bible that talk about the fact that they tore down every wall and there was not a stone left on top of another one. The destruction in AD 70 was incredible. It was an incredible thing. And Jesus was actually talking about the fact that he was going to destroy, as you'll see that he goes on, he's going to destroy the temple. But when they heard that this was going to be all torn down, they had heard Jesus say that he was going to destroy the temple. They had heard that prior. He's actually spoken that back in 21, and back in chapter 23, he's actually talked about those things. But in this case, Jesus is actually talking about the physical temple is actually going to be torn down. His disciples, they were shaken. They didn't understand. They already, you and I both know this, they had an issue completing the concept in the mind, connecting the dots in their mind that what Jesus was about to do was not physical. They still had this feeling that they were with a person like the judge who would, back in Israel's old days, where they would become oppressed, they leave God, they become oppressed, and then God would send a judge who would bring them out of that bondage. And they still had that same sort of feeling. Even if you look back at, say, the Maccabean revolt, where the Maccabees actually revolted against the government of that day and for a little while won back the temple. They were thinking of a physical thing. Right up until Jesus died, right up until the Garden of Gethsemane, they're still thinking about a physical thing, as if Jesus was going to have a physical army, have a physical battle, and reestablish them as a physical power here on earth. They had that battle for a long time, and I think we've all seen that. So when they look at this is hard for them to understand, certainly hard for them to accept. So look at what happens after that. So after that, it says that he went out. It says, as he sat on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately, saying, tell us when these things will be, what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age. Depending on how your Bible phrases that, you may see it as two questions, where the second question is a two-part, or you may see it as three questions. It's still, in essence, three questions that's been asked. But I want you to pick up on this. Jesus is leaving the temple, verse 1, and now, verse 3, he's sitting on the Mount of Olives. I don't have the complete map of Jerusalem in my head with all the streets and stuff, but this I can tell you. Jerusalem, if you're looking at the map, if I were the map, Jerusalem would sit here, okay? The Mount of Olives will be just outside of Jerusalem. We're talking about maybe, I know that I went ahead and like Google mapped it so that if you had to drive it, it was 1.3 miles to go from the temple over to the Mount of Olives. Probably Jesus could have walked more straight there because the streets now aren't the streets then. But ultimately, maybe he walks a half mile or a little more than that to get there. But it's on the way to Bethany. You see, this is the week that he's about to die. He's about to go to the cross. This is that Tuesday before he goes to the cross. And he's talking to his disciples about the fact that he is about ready to go and sacrifice himself and establish his kingdom. And ultimately, they didn't get that, but this is why they had to hear this parable. Now, they asked three questions, and I want you to hang your hat on these three questions. When will these things be? When will these things be? When is this temple going to be destroyed? No stone left upon another. And then, what will be the sign of your coming? What they meant was they knew that Jesus was supposed to come back. Jesus, in that very Jesus-y way that he does stuff, talks about the sign of his coming in two senses. He talks about the sign of his coming as a king and establishing his kingdom. We call that the church. And then there is his actual physical return, which is the last day. And then they also ask, hey, what is the end of the age? And also, in a very Jesus-y way, and I say that with the most respect, Jesus gives them an answer about the end of the age that's actually more complex than the question they asked, because they don't have the concept that one age is ending and they're entering into the last age. And so he explains that. And so what we're going to see is that when Jesus in Matthew 24 talks about this, look at what he tells them. He's going to answer that first question, when will these things be? So in Matthew 24, I've actually got up there 1 through 34. This entire part of the passage is giving you, the reader, what Jesus told them, the hearer, the answer to when will these things be. He gives them signs. He gives them warnings. He gives them things to watch out for. Look and see what he says. We're not going to read the whole thing, but we'll talk about a few of them. He says, look, for many will come in my name saying, I'm the Christ, and and they will lead many astray. And you will hear wars and rumors of wars. See that you're not alarmed, for this must take place, but the end is not yet. So he tells them, look, you're going to see some signs. There's going to be more people pop up who say they're the Messiah. There's going to be wars and rumors of wars. He actually says later, these have to happen. Then he's going to talk about the fact that you're going to hear of kingdom rising against kingdom, that there's going to be famines and earthquakes. I will let you know that in that time period we're talking about from when Jesus died until AD 70, there was an unusual amount of earthquakes in the Asia Minor region. Now, earthquakes happen all the time. I'm going to just tell you, I actually was looking at the numbers, and up to 500,000 earthquakes happen throughout any one year all across the world. You probably don't even feel almost any of them. Certainly you, as a human, would have to be close to it to feel it. Maybe 100,000 of them even register on the different seismographs that are out there in the places around the world. So if Jesus was talking about something that's coming still yet in the future, all of these earthquakes would have had people frazzled, but it's not talking about something that's yet to happen in the future. He was talking about something that was going to happen that basically they were going to see. And there was an inordinate amount of earthquakes that happened in that area in that time frame. Continuing on, though, look here at Matthew 24. It says, "Then many will fall away and betray one another and hate one another." And there was a whole lot of that already starting to go on in Jerusalem. And as the siege started to happen, people sold other folks out to try to gain position, to try to gain safety. You might have a header that talks about the abomination of desolation. Verse 15, "So when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of the prophet Daniel standing in the holy place, then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains." Now I'm going to ask you something, and I'm going to throw out a term. It's not a term found in the Bible, but it's a term said out primarily in the denominational world throughout Christendom, and I always make this symbol to talk about everybody who claims to be a follower of Christ. We know there's a lot of slices of that pie, but there's a huge portion of that I will call denominational. I grew up in a denominational church. I grew up hearing this word all the time, and that word was rapture. And I'm just going to give you the main version, because there are 4 or 5 versions of it, but the main version is this thought, that for whatever reason, it's developed into, well, Christ was going to come back. He's going to take the people who are alive and the people who have already died in him and going to take them away to heaven. And then there's going to be a 7-year tribulation. And then at the end of that 7-year tribulation, there's going to be Armageddon. And then Jesus is going to come back and establish an earthly throne and reign for 1,000 years. And then at the end of that time will be the end of the world and judgment. Now that's a lot to get out of the Bible, because I'm telling you, when you read it, you don't really see those things. Can you get the term 1,000-year reign? Yeah, you can see that. Can you get the term about resurrection of people who were alive at the time and the dead? Yeah, you can see those things. But it's never pieced together that way. It just simply isn't said that way. And think about this. If the quote unquote, the word rapture, nowhere in the Bible, but that's how that's termed, rapture. Ultimately, if the rapture was to have already occurred, by the way, it's not yet coming. There's a lot of people believe that it already occurred. It was a secret thing. If the rapture was supposed to happen, it was supposed to be, or it's going to be a secret thing. And yet, Jesus says every eye is going to see him. Every knee is going to bow. Frankly, when we look at what's going to happen when Jesus comes back, I want you to go ahead and do it now. I'm going to use this later in the worship service. I want you to go to 2 Thessalonians and look at the 1st chapter. I know you'll see it as familiar, but go look at the first chapter and look at verses 7 and 8. And look at what Paul lays out as the mechanism, the timing of Christ's return. He's going to come back. He's going to bring with him his saints, and he's going to take vengeance. He's going to return, and he's going to take vengeance with flaming fire. And the people who he's going to avenge are the people who don't know God and have not obeyed the gospel. There's no 1,000-year reign time period in there. It is he comes back in judgment. He comes back in judgment. He comes back. People are going to be judged when he comes back. So that whole idea of rapture is foreign to the scriptures. You have to really bend and twist. You have to reach around your elbow to touch your nose, to use an old saying, in order to get there. Because I got to point this one last thing out to you. Why would Jesus be saying, hey, here's the signs. Here it comes. Be ready for it. And then when you see those signs, flee to the mountains. If you're his, isn't he going to take you on if the rapture is true? If the rapture is going to happen, aren't you going to be taken up whether you're hiding in the mountains or whether you're here? Why? Why does he give a warning and then instruction for them to leave? Now I'm going to point something out to you that if you were to dig back into the histories, and there's 2 or 3 of them written about this time period, one certainly by Josephus, the Jewish historian, but by the way, he was actually funded by a Roman official, so he was doing it as a Roman official. And so it's, but there's 2 or 3 other of these. I want you to know that north of Jerusalem, again, if you were looking at the map, an area called Pera, P-E-R-A, right up here, a mountainous region, and that is actually where a lot of Jews and a lot of Christian Jews left the city that believed these things, and they got out of there and they got away from them. Most of the Jewish people didn't believe what Jesus had to say, and they stayed there, and they were slaughtered. They were starved, and then they came into the city and they slaughtered. And they say, not biblical writings, we're talking about extra biblical writings, historical documents say that literally the streets ran with blood. And there was even one statement that you could walk completely across the city and never step on the ground for the bodies of the Hebrews that were dead there. It was an incredibly amazing and the worst, said by people of that day, the worst slaughter that had ever been seen in the world. But Jesus actually warned people and said, hey, run away from this. If that were the end of the world, if that was the rapture, there'd be no reason for him to say that. So ultimately, he tells them that destruction of the temple, that it's coming, and he gives him a way. He gives them a way to see signs about that so that they can understand. And he even says in verse 19, alas for women who are pregnant and for those who are nursing infants in those days. Pray that your flight may not be in winter or on the Sabbath. He's saying, look, if you're pregnant, if you're caring for a young one, and you've got to run for your life, this is going to be hard. Hey, you don't want it to be wintertime when it's sloggy and wet and sloppy and cold on top of that. He said, because you're going to have to escape this. There's no escaping judgment, but there's an escaping of this temple. And so he gives them warning about when those things would be. And if you continue to read, you're going to see all the way through 34, he's talking about those things. He gave multiple signs for this. Now, the sign of your coming, well, Jesus is coming back. We recognize that. Sitting here nearly 2,000 years later, we know that one day he's going to come back. But we also recognize, as members of his church, as members of his kingdom, that his kingdom came when he beat death. That when he died for us, resurrected by himself. No one actually said, hey, like he said, Lazarus come forth and brought Lazarus out of the grave. There was nobody out there doing that. He did it himself. He beat death. Ultimately, when he beat death, he established his kingdom. We know that on Pentecost that the first gospel message was given, and his kingdom started to grow right there. So he came. The sign of his coming is actually spoken of in those last couple of verses. Take a look at them with me, because I'm telling you, a lot of folks who agree with this, they still shy away from this. But here's the thing. So look at this. So also when you see all these things, know that he is near and at the very gates. Truly I say, this generation will not pass away, verse 34, until these things have taken place. But I've got to tell you, if you look back in verse 30 and 31, some of that stuff sounds like he's talking about the second coming. But I want to caution you here, because if you go and look at some passages in Isaiah, and you go and look at some of the other instances where huge toppling of governments or kingdoms happened, this language was used. Then will appear in heaven the sign of the Son of Man, that all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds in heaven with power and great glory. Is he not king now? Does he not have power? Does he not have great glory? So this is talking about him coming into his kingship. You might be wavering right now going, oh, Louis, I don't know. You might be stretching it. You hang with me through the worship service, and you're going to walk out the door and you're going to see this passage differently than you might see it right now. But this is him talking about him coming into his own as king of his kingdom, or the church that we belong to. And when he says he'll send out his angels with a loud trumpet, and they shall gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other, this is actually imagery that's been used before to talk about these shifts, these huge shifts, and that was coming on. But when you're talking about that day and that hour, look and see what he says. Verse 36 is pivotal. Verse 36 is pivotal, because the day Jesus' return of that day and hour, it's going to be a surprise. There will be no signs. There will be no signs. I'm going to say it a third time. There will be no signs. And he spends the next rest of this chapter and all the 25 preparing his disciples to understand this. He goes on and he says, look, by the way, the end of the age. Yes, the end of the age of the Old Testament, that covenant was going away. But as far as the end of the age, or the end of the coming age, in other words, the age that we live in right now, that's going to be a mystery. So he spends time with some different parables to instruct his disciples to understand that that's what's coming. You're about to step into a new age, and the end of that age, I can tell you when this age is going to end, the end of the Old Testament covenant, the old law. It's going to end, the temple's going to be destroyed, and it's physically not going to exist. But the religious way that men approaches God is changing, and that's going to be a new age. And that age, the end of it, you're not going to know when it's coming. And so he actually tells three parables. He tells the parable, if you'll look toward the end of chapter 30 or chapter 24, verse 45. Who then is faithful and the wise servant? So he tells that one. Okay. And then, if you'll go and look, he tells one about 10 bridesmaids. You may have a version that say the virgins. You may have a version that say torchbearers. All the same people. All the same people. Okay? I don't have time to get into the culture of that particular day, but those are all. It's basically how they did weddings back then. But ultimately, he took a look at that, and then he tells the parable of the talents. So I'm going to go back on and show you something. Let's see. There we go. There's the backwards. So when you look at the parable of the faithful and wise, he said, look, be found doing my will. I'm going to tell you my will. Be found doing my will when I come back, because it's going to be a surprise. That's what he tells them in that parable. Then the bridesmaid, you better be prepared. You better have already gotten things ready, because there won't be time to get things ready when he comes. And that's what that parable is about. But then the parable of the talents. Why does he tell them that? hey, you're not going to know when it's happening, you're not going to know when it's coming. But in this particular parable, it's not about the surprise. He's given him two parables to say, you're not going to know when I come back. On this parable, he actually tells them about talent. So what is a talent? A talent's a piece of weight. A talent weighs about 33.2 kilograms. That's around 73 pounds. And one of those guys got 5 of them. 73 pounds, if they were talents of gold, and it doesn't say what they were, but if they were talents of gold, in today's market, that'd be somewhere around $2 million worth. This was a huge, whatever it was a huge amount of money. It was a treasure that he gave to his servants. Servant A got almost 400 pounds, 365 pounds of whatever this money was. And we do know it was money because he said, hey, you need to take my money. So was it silver, was it gold? It was a huge treasure. Second one got around almost 150 pounds, and the last one got around 75 pounds, not quite 75 pounds. Ultimately, though, when that first servant came back, they would have picked up on this weight. That's why I'm laying this out in poundage. He comes back with almost 800 pounds of money, of treasure for his master. You think his master doesn't think he has done good? He says, oh, good and faithful servant, look at what he brought back. He brought back that much more weight of treasure. B brought back almost 300 pounds of treasure. So you can see why this master was pleased just from the weight of what was going on. But I will tell you that the 73 pounds that he left to servant C, as I'm calling him, and that servant did nothing with them, he was angry about that. He was not pleased about that. He took it away and gave it to the guy. I'm assuming it was the guy. And now that guy has over 800 pounds of treasure. And he's also going to be set over a whole lot more responsibility. You know, each servant was actually entrusted by what he gave them, and he tested each servant because he already said he knew their abilities, but he tested each servant, and the test was passed by 2 of the 3 servants. But there was one servant who didn't take this weight. He didn't take the weight of this treasure. Inherently, Jesus is impressed upon his disciples, and they would have picked up on this. You and I reading talents, I don't think we pick it up until we see it this way. He's talking, think about what they had to do. They had to take that guy that got 5 talents, he had to take that huge amount of weight and do something with it. He had to physically move it. He had to haul it, he had to protect it, he had to guard it, but he also then had to invest it. This was not an uncomplex task. Look at the first guy. All he had to do. You know, if you had actually 1 talent of gold, if you took a 2-liter bottle and put in just a little bit less, maybe about that much less, and you had that full of gold, that would weigh about 73 pounds. That's about how much. See, servant C, he could carry that 1 talent. He could do that. But ultimately, those other guys, they had a lot more they had to deal with. But this is what Jesus ended up doing. He said this new covenant, it's going to require an action. It's going to not only require an action, but it's going to require a commitment to that action. His disciples would have picked up on the weight of what this commitment was. And guess what? That task laid before them was spreading the gospel. And they absolutely did spread the gospel. And frankly, Paul actually says they spread it to all creation by the time the Colossian letter was written. Doesn't mean we still don't have work to do today. We do. But in the known world then, they had spread that message. Spreading the gospel is the weight that Christ was pointing out to them. And the job that his disciples have is to do that job. And ultimately, that's why they needed to hear that. And ultimately, we had the same burden. I'm going to back this up and get it out of the way. Thank you for your time and attention. And as we head into the next period, we're going to pick up right there for the worship service. Thank you.